When we think about sustainability in food, we often think about the means in which our food production and consumption can sustain the well-being of our natural environments.
Foods that won't deplete our land, water, and energy resources in order to be grown.
Foods that aren't wrapped and packed in some form of single-use packaging.
Or foods that are actually eaten before it expires, avoiding the straight path of production to disposal.
But sustainability in food is also the means of sustaining people's accessibility to these foods, and we need to recognize that not everyone's on equal footing.
We welcome Dr. Zafar Adeel to this space, the Executive Director of the Pacific Water Research Center. It's a program at SFU's Faculty of Environment that addresses water quality and security issues at both a local and a global scale. They have a project called NEAT, Nutrition Through Engagement in Agricultural Technologies. And today, we get to hear more about their collaborative greenhouse and community garden project with the Kitasoo Xai'xais First Nation in Klumptu.
Hi, I'm Zafar Adeel. I'm the Executive Director for the Pacific Water Research Center, and I also serve as the Professor of Professional Practice in SFU's School of Sustainable Energy Engineering. Well, NEAT is a project which stands for Nutrition Through Engagement and Agricultural Technologies. It's a project that is meant to support and help remote communities, particularly Indigenous communities in British Columbia, to achieve water, energy, and food security on a long-term sustainable basis. When we started this project, there was a fairly open dialogue where a number of voices were included, and we identified that First Nations, in terms of food insecurity, were at the highest level of risk, and the kind of challenges that they had were also the greatest. So we thought that if we are going to address water, energy, and food security in remote communities in British Columbia, then perhaps it's best to start with the Indigenous communities and First Nations first. So I think there are three broad reasons why there is food insecurity. Of course, many of these communities are remote. Access to getting to these communities is difficult and expensive, and that means it takes a lot of time to get fresh food supplies out there, and it becomes expensive. Secondly, the influence of colonial practices have been quite significant on these communities because they have essentially lost, to a large extent, the traditional knowledge they had in terms of gathering food, processing food, and that puts them at a higher risk. Similarly, access to health facilities and health services is relatively poor. That means that when you end up with food-related problems, for example, high level of diabetes, which is quite common in some of these communities, the health services are typically not there to support the communities and the members to address their health. All of these factors combined lead to a higher level of food insecurity for First Nations. So I think there's a number of reasons why we picked Kitasoo. Firstly, all the elements that I just described in terms of remoteness, colonial influences, and health impacts on the community, all of them were present. But I think in some ways it was even more important that the community was ready, and they had champions within the communities who were quite eager to address the food insecurity issues. We also had prior experience from those who were involved in the design of the project who had worked previously with the community. So there was this sense of familiarity and a measure of trust, which allowed us to focus in and zoom in on the Kitasoo and Xai'xais First Nations in Klumptu. We worked with the community to make sure that the hardware for food production was all in place. The greenhouse was in a state of disrepair for a number of years. So we worked with the community members to identify how it could be restored. There were local technicians who worked with us to restore it, to provide water supply inside the greenhouse. And then we brought in a number of materials and soils from outside Klumptu to set up these grow boxes. And again, our team members worked hand in hand with the community members to physically build the grow boxes and put in the soil in them. We were also fortunate that our partnership with Embark Sustainability allowed us to bring a master gardener to Klamtu, and he worked closely with the family members who were setting up their own grow boxes. So he helped them in understanding how food is grown, how plants are protected, and also how food can be harvested in a safe way and used. So all of these components were important in ensuring that the physical space for growing gardens, for growing vegetables and fruits is in place. So there's actually quite a lot of different types of plants and vegetables and fruits which are grown, everything from kale and lettuce and tomatoes to strawberries, melons. Different families that are managing their own grow boxes have choices to pick from, and there's a range of vegetables and fruits that they can choose and grow on their own. The idea with these grow boxes is to supplement any food supplies that might be coming in through ferries from outside Klamtu. And these food supplies from outside are both a lot of processed food and some fresh produce, except that by the time the fresh produce gets to the community, it's not so fresh anymore. So the locally grown food, vegetables, fruits, etc., actually help supplement the food supply. So we felt at the very beginning when this project was being designed that it was important to get the youth engaged in a number of different ways. And it's important because particularly inside the community, it allows families to come together, and typically it's the youth who are getting excited about these new opportunities for growing food. It also helps bring the community together. So NEAT has made also an extra effort to engage youth at SFU, both graduate and undergraduate students, in getting both hands-on experience in working in the community on food security issues, and also contributing to the achievement of sustainability of food security in Klamtu. So we've had some very good experience, even in the midst of the pandemic, to have students from SFU work with us remotely, of course, in developing guidebooks for the community, recipe books, and also preparing content for workshops, which are going to be critically important in ensuring that the community is set up for using these fresh food supplies in the long run. So in terms of ensuring that the work that is being done in Klamtu is secured in the long term, I think there's three types of initiatives that we focused on. Firstly, and I think most importantly, it's important to get the community excited about the work that is being done. And we've always tried to identify people who would champion these initiatives and continue them. And the idea is that eventually the PWRC team should be able to step away from the project, and all the initiatives that have been started would continue. So secondly, we have provided training and capacity building to the people inside the community who are responsible for maintaining the greenhouse and for producing food. And we have had the assistance and support from master gardeners who have worked with the community to provide that training. And thirdly, we are working with the community to build a business model so that there is a revenue stream generated from particularly the plants and vegetables which are grown in the greenhouse. And the idea is that the local ecotourism lodge can work with us and use the produce coming from the greenhouse. So in a way, the whole process becomes self-sustaining over a long period of time.
We are grateful to share this space with our second guest, Dr. Tammara Soma, an assistant professor at the Resource and Environmental Management Department at SFU. She is the co-founder and research director of the Food Systems Lab, a research hub centering on sustainable food systems, food waste, and community-based initiatives. Together, we'll dive further into the food inaccessibility crisis.
And greetings from Burnaby Mountain, the unceded ancestral and traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. My name is Dr. Tammara Soma. I'm a registered professional planner. I also call myself a food system planner. So it's basically a planner that integrates food system consideration into everything that they do. And I'm an assistant professor at the Faculty of Environment, School of Resource and Environmental Management planning program. So that's a bit of a mouthful. And at the School of Resource and Environmental Management, or I like to call it REM, I am the co-founder and the research director of the Food Systems Lab. So the Food Systems Lab is a social innovation lab. It's a research lab. It's also a hub of learning about everything from farm to fork to table. Well, I said fork, so fork and table, they're the same thing, and beyond. So everything from sustainable agriculture to food waste and consumption to circular economy and packaging. I kind of cover that entire realm with a lot of my wonderful colleagues and research assistants. A lot of how we view the world currently and how the business industry works and how agriculture works is like from a linear supply chain. And the linear supply chain, whether it is food or plastics or any other, or even fashion, it's basically so extraction, make, and then dispose. Right? So it's just a linear, and there's a lot of externalities, a lot of pollution, and a systems approach understands that everything is interconnected, and instead of creating waste, we try to design the waste out of the system so that it's regenerative. And when you think of regenerative, you might think of, oh, there's regenerative agriculture, but it's not just regenerative agriculture, it's everything regenerative, from our fashion to the packaging that we use to just our whole lifestyle. So like that is this systems approach is basically an understanding that of interconnectivity and the importance of trying to find solutions and trying to solve problems in a way that does not create more harm. The question around food bank as a solution to hunger or food insecurity is an important one, and it is a question. Food bank is somewhat of a solution, right, to the issue of hunger, and the question of whether or not this is the appropriate long-term solution or the sustainable solution towards hunger is something that has been kind of grappled and addressed by numerous food studies scholars. And the reason why it's so important to address this is because food banks started as kind of an emergency response. But then 40 years later, what we're seeing an increasing number, and not only an increasing number, but a scaling up of the infrastructure for the food bank. So the reason why this is problematic is because we realize that, hey, you know what? All of the growth in food bank it's not really actually addressing hunger, because hunger is growing. And not only is hunger growing, we have over 4 million Canadians who are food insecure. Many of them are children. And with COVID, this number has increased. Demand for food bank has increased. And the thing is, food banks rely on donations. Food bank also rely on a lot of surplus corporate, what is called quote unquote food waste. It's not really waste. It's like surplus food, but at the same time, it's unwanted. It's unmarketable. And so the thing is, if we really think about, people's dignity, it's really inappropriate as a long-term solution to address people's food insecurity issue, which is really based on income, with a solution where you expect people to line up for a very long time, give their ID or a letter of proof of income to prove that they're actually, poor. And then are given bags or what have you that they might not have the power to choose from, right? I think some food banks are kind of like in the supermarket model where you get to choose one of each, so there's some sort of power still for the community members. But then others are just like, here's the hamper, you take it. If you don't like it, well, so be it. The fact that we kind of accept that, well, some people just have to just live with it, right? And they don't get to have a choice. That's just not appropriate. So it's this idea of we really need to challenge this two-tiered food system where one group of the population gets to choose, gets to have the sovereignty or the power to make decisions for their own health and body. And then there's others who have to live with kind of like the variables of whatever corporations want to donate with them to them, at a certain point in time. So I think great Food bank is great for emergency, and things like that. Disaster relief, great. But to as a long-term sustainable solution to food insecurity, definitely not a good systemic solution. There are many systemic and racial challenges and barriers that create food insecurity outside of income, but it's all interconnected. So racism can result in the lack of income, which then results in food insecurity, and vice versa, right? So we think about issues such as redlining. So in the United States, and even in Canada, there's actually also like issues around planning and racism. So in redlining in the United States, for example, people of color, particularly African Americans, they were not even allowed to get a mortgage, right? So banks would reject them. So then they wouldn't have that power to be able to have a house or home ownership. And in fact, some neighborhoods were purposefully against having African Americans come in, right? They would have signage to say whites only spaces. You have racism in education sector where, depending on how you look like, your name or what have you, only the most privileged can actually attend higher education. So if you think about all of the structural barriers from education to health, so if communities of color are discriminated because of their race or what have you, and then they don't have good access to health, they don't have good access to education, they are rejected from a mortgage or loans or to access certain neighborhoods, then you have like compending, added systemic problems that then of course eventually leads to issues like food insecurity, but it also leads to poor health, it results to gender discrimination. So the COVID pandemic obviously it's a pandemic, it's chaotic, and in fact, so we did a study, Food Systems Lab did a study with the BC Poverty Reduction Coalition, and our study tried to better understand community members' access to food hubs, so like nonprofit food hubs, before COVID and during COVID. And what we found is that, obviously these are community members who, for the most part, many of them are already vulnerable. Many of them have health issues and disability. And then we have issues around transportation, not even being able to go in the back end for a very long time. And then the only place that they go to, which is like some of the nonprofit food hubs, they were closed. So a lot of the community centers in the city of Vancouver were closed, and these were centers that actually had food programs. And so suddenly community members who, for the majority of their diet or for a big chunk of their diet relied on these centers for food, they were left with nothing. For community members that had underlying health issues, and then they had to go get food, that is they are made more vulnerable by having to go on public transit, right? And for other people who have money, they can get food deliveries, but that's not always the case with low-income community members. So again, this goes back to systemic and structural issues. The one thing with COVID that is kind of like shared a little bit of a light, is that a lot more people are starting to realize that you can't just take food for granted. A lot more people are interested in gardening. A lot more people are interested in supporting farmers, in growing their own food. And so that's all good. The one thing that we just need to remember is that this can't just be like a movement and kind of like this thing of an elite, right? It can't just be for people of privilege. We need to make sure that a just and sustainable food system is available for all. There are multiple ways as an individual to support a sustainable food system. So the one I'll talk about the more individual kind of like piece first. And so the more individual piece is, yes, if you have a plot of land, if you're involved in a gardening program at school, such as Embark Sustain, right? There are gardens available and boxes available, then do that. Learn how to grow your own food. You need it for survival anyway. So do learn about that. Take a food course, become more aware of, the importance of food literacy, the importance of supporting migrant farm workers. Again, migrant farm workers are, kind of the backbone of really Canadian society in terms of their contribution to agriculture, the fact that the food that we eat, if it comes from BC, it's most likely picked by a migrant farm worker. So we need to remember them. And so, of course, things like that education piece, the tangible experiential learning piece, that's all good. But then there's the more systemic piece. So as an individual, it's important for us to vote for politicians and leaders that actually care about sustainable food system. We need to create a collective movement. So, for example, if Embark Sustain, there's so many students, and really amazing people within the organization, then what you need to do is, bring in some of these, on politician nominees, right? Okay, so you want to be a leader, you want to be an MLA, you want to be an MP, MPP, or what have you. Well, then come and talk to the students, because we care about a sustainable food system, and us students, like all, whatever, 5,000 of us or 50,000 of us, we want to make sure that you're going to be accountable. If you're a leader, we want you to support sustainable and just food system related policies. And that's how you can make that systemic and structural changes. So yes, do the individual piece, but make sure that you choose, elect leaders that are good, that care, and that you also create this kind of collective movement, so that Embark is not just like seen as, or like SFU students are not just seen as just individuals, but actually we are a big collective body. We demand change, and then suddenly we are no longer like so powerless. The thing that I would say with post-secondary students is that tuition is getting higher and higher. Living costs, especially if you're in any of the big cities like Toronto, or even in Metro Vancouver, that's also getting higher. And so therefore, students want to better themselves. They want to get a post-secondary education because they want to make sure that they have a good job and they can contribute to society. But at the end of the day, it's like, what can I afford? So, if you have a certain amount and you need to buy a textbook and your computer breaks down, at the end of the day, students would skimp on food. The fact that universities across Canada are building food banks, or are creating food banks within the university campus, it's something to be shocked at. It's not something to celebrate. We shouldn't be celebrating, oh wow, we have a food bank on campus. Like, that is scary, because if you think about all of the wealth, all of the knowledge, if universities, which is the center and the hub of knowledge, can't even figure out how to make their students' life much better, and actually have to have a food bank on campus, that means that we're not really using our expertise, right? So I'm a big believer in walking the talk. And I think universities need to do a lot more in walking the talk. So it's not just about, oh, we have research and theories on food security. We have research and theories on how to create more just society. But hey, you know what? Let's make the just society starting from the university level first. And I think that's why the work of groups like Meal Exchange, if students are interested in learning more about issues around food insecurity and the student experience, check out Meal Exchange. They do a lot of good work across the country. I think it's really, really important that we create more spaces to platform and leverage Indigenous voices, particularly Indigenous food sovereignty movements. When we talk to Indigenous elders and what have you, they have a lot of knowledge about living with the land. I think many of us, though, are quite distant and disconnected. So I think it's really important, particularly with Embark, if you can create more spaces so that students can learn more from Indigenous voices on how can you truly live in a sustainable way, because it has been done for millennia, but it was basically taken away and destroyed through residential school, right? That's where people were disconnected from their knowledge, their culture, their traditional foods. It's been disrupted by colonialism across the world. Many countries around the world have been colonized, and in the process of colonization, a lot of cultures have been suppressed and oppressed. And so I think it's really important for us to, kind of shift things around and really change that colonial mindset to create a more interconnected, relational paradigm that realize, we're all different, but we all have to contribute towards one another, and we need to value that. And I think that's kind of the way to go. We all have different identities, but at the end of the day, for me, we are earthlings. And so I think what we need to understand, that sustainable, equitable, truly just food system is one that sustains us all, where people are not taking more than what they need. It's about really kind of, putting us all in the same, in a more equitable platform, and not harm others in our way of trying to sustain ourselves.
Food injustice is experienced differently for every individual, but it can mean anything from inaccessibility to nutritious foods, going without meals, diet-related illnesses, and dealing with inflated costs.
The kinds of people who are most severely affected by these injustices are essential to consider, because our food system is deeply unsustainable, oppressive, oppressive and does not meet the needs of many, including the Black, Indigenous, and people of color community, those of low income, and/or those with disabilities.
In Vancouver, local food sources come from unceded territories of Indigenous peoples. Yet, 54.2% of Indigenous households in Canada located on reserves report food insecurity.
Historically, we've also seen how community land in inner city neighborhoods become an opportunity for eco-gentrification, where land is revamped to create greener spaces in order to attract wealthier residents.
With this inequitable acquisition of land, low-income and marginalized communities are forced to pay more to stay in the location, or pushed out of their community. We go into this topic in greater detail in future episodes, so stay tuned.
Creating sustainable food systems is also addressing the problem of food waste.
Here at Embark, we run what's called the Food Rescue Program. It's where we collect imperfect-looking produce from Nestor's Market that doesn't meet the selling criteria of supermarkets, but are still healthy and good to eat.
We redistribute this food for the SFU community for free or by donation. The program is temporarily paused because of the pandemic, but we hope to start again soon.
And if you want to learn more about food injustice and what you can do, check out the resources in our description. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode. Next week, you'll be learning a bit more about us, exploring each of our cultures in relation to sustainability. We also share a chat with Iona and Paulo from Capè, a social venture promoting farmer-first and ethically sourced coffee from Philippine indigenous growers. See you next week!